Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Ooh, a lot of horse crap, probably.
When I
Hey,
ask you
guys.
to imagine
Um, wonder what they did. Like a weekly horse poop removal and just use it as fertilizer or something. How did cities work before cars? Let's learn. Canubis, do subscribe, preemptive like. How did cities work before cars? I'm repeating myself. I'm interested, guys. I wonder if you went back in time to say 600 years ago, maybe 700 years ago, 800 years ago. Do you think you would be more likely to get sick, or do you think you'd be more likely to make them sick? Because think about it. Their immune systems are probably really strong because there was poor sanitation back then, and so their bodies probably had to adapt. However, on the other hand, you're from the future, and so you have probably been exposed to certain types of bacteria and germs that their bodies were never exposed to. And so maybe they would get sick. Maybe you both would get sick. I don't know, but I think that's an interesting question. Let's go.
a city from before the past few When I ask you to imagine a city from before the past few hundred years, what do you imagine? Do you imagine people crowding around in narrow, winding streets to haggle on local markets? Basically the kinds of places you saw during your Euro trip last summer, except maybe minus the tacky souvenir stores and overpriced currency exchanges? Well, take a look at this. This is the Canopic Way in Alexandria, as depicted in Assassin's Creed Origins. And if you look closely, you might notice something that seems a little anachronistic. Like, is that a
I thought that was real for. Oh, these are for. I've learned about these. I think it was when it rained. These are a little bit elevated, so you could walk across the street without getting your feet wet. Maybe. I think.
crosswalk? Connecting sidewalks? 2,000 years before cars were even invented? So that all made me wonder, how did cities function in pre-modern times, before cars, metros, railroads, or even proper sewers were a thing? How different was city life before the Industrial Revolution, and how similar was it to today? One thing is immediately clear when comparing ancient cities to their modern counterparts. They were far smaller, both in area and in population. In AD 100, Rome is thought to have boasted a population of over 1 million people, all squeezed into an area of barely over 13 square kilometers, including the parts of the city that spilled out past the Servian walls. While 1 million people is hardly anything to sneeze at, hint hint, a city of 1 million today is hardly impressive in the slightest. What with cities like Tokyo holding 40 times as many people, but assuming the 1 million number.
That's crazy. The state I live in has about 1 million people. Rhode Island. It's the smallest state, so never mind.
Number is accurate, holding 40 times as many people, but assuming the 1 million number is accurate, this means Rome at its height was about 3 times denser than modern Manhattan, or even denser than modern Manila. One of the main reasons for this, of course, was transportation. Without any cars or bikes or even any sort of public transportation, most people just walked everywhere, limiting cities to the radius of human stamina. No surprise about that, but that sort of understates the role of horses and carts in pre-modern cities, which even in 49 BC would have necessitated wider roads and boulevards, such as Alexandria's Canopic Way. They understood basic road hierarchy, what can I say? But of course, these carts weren't darting through the city center at 50 kilometers an hour, and these wide boulevards weren't exactly closed off to pedestrians like their modern counterparts.
Okay, so because there would be a lot more dense, despite some having some pretty wide roads, but much less area dedicated to transportation infrastructure as compared to today. And so what would have been used for transportation stuff, like trains, highways, whatever, would just be also filled up with shops and homes and walkable paths, right? So it'd be more dense. Makes sense, if I understood that right.
And these wide boulevards weren't exactly closed off to pedestrians like their modern counterparts. So what gives with the crosswalks? Well, if we look at images like these of Pompeii, we see that the stones making up the crosswalks were actually raised up quite a bit off the ground.
Think for water?
With so many horses and draft animals on the roads, it shouldn't be surprising to anyone who knows how organisms work that these roads got very messy very quickly.
Oh, God. Oh, imagine the smell. I'm sure they got used to it. Okay, so it was actually to not step in excrement. Makes sense. Oh, imagine. Oh my God. Imagine it started raining a lot. Where, like, at a point where I'm trying not to say like so much, where the streets hadn't been cleaned in a while, and then it would just be a river of horse pee and poop and who knows what else.
And so these crosswalks were not the sole designated crossing area, but were more like stepping stones, so people could cross the road without having to step in literal horse shit. In fact, cities like Rome and Alexandria even had strict rules and regulations in place on when carts were allowed inside the city's gates, so they wouldn't jam the already crowded streets. Wait, walls, that's another thing cities don't do anymore. Up until a few hundred years ago, cities generally had some sort of fortification, which was another factor keeping these cities so small. That doesn't mean development never happened outside of a city's walls, quite the opposite actually, as that's often where a city's ports were located, but this yields one particular question: why don't modern cities ever build walls anymore? Well, for one, the answer doesn't have to do with cannons. But as anyone who's ever tried this in Minecraft knows, city walls were incredibly hard to build. But there were also a lot of other factors making walls more expensive than they were worth building and maintaining. One source I came across in my research suggests that the gradual economic shift from storing one's wealth in animals and metals to checkbooks and bank accounts, which are arguably far harder for raiders to just run off with, at least played a large role in making city walls obsolete.
Interesting. So they became less worth it because you had stuff that was more difficult. I'm just repeating what he just said. I understood what he said. Okay.
Regardless, by the 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of cities stopped surrounding themselves with traditional walls in favor of strategically placed fortresses, such as the star forts of the colonial era. Walls weren't only used for defensive purposes, however, as can be seen with the remnants of the Berlin Customs Wall, not to be confused with the more famous wall from the 20th century. By the 18th century, the city's old defensive walls had fallen out of use, and were instead replaced by a much shorter wall going around the city, built not to keep out siege armies, but to levy taxes and tariffs on goods going in and out of the city. So while they couldn't necessarily keep out an invading army, they were good at keeping people from sneaking carts past the customs gates.
Okay.
Most of this wall has been torn down these days, however, including most of the gates, leaving behind nothing but their names in the form of all the S and U-Bahn stations ending with the word Tor.
I forget if I reacted to it or not, but I was watching a video on medieval guilds, and it was fascinating. And talking about building walls to make sure people entering and exiting could be seen and taxed and whatnot made me think of it. How they were essentially like worker union / monopoly. I can't explain it well, but it was fascinating. Medieval guilds are really cool. Just a great, thoughtful statement by me. I know, sorry.
The only one standing, of course, is the world-famous Brandenburg Gate, named so like...
I gotta stop. Okay.
Customs gates. Most of this wall has been torn down these days, however, including most of the gates, leaving behind nothing but their names in the form of all the S and U-Bahn stations ending with the word Tor. The only one standing, of course, is the world-famous Brandenburg Gate, named so, like most city gates, after the city it led to, in this case, Brandenburg, which would also explain why nearby Potsdam also has a Brandenburg Gate. This was also the case in Alexandria, of course, where the Canopic Way passed through the Canopic Gate, forming a road that eventually led to the city of Canopus. Not to be confused with Canubis. In the age of city walls, though...
I don't know why that made me smile. It just kind of did. Just the gates being named after where they led to. It makes me think of I don't know. I can't explain it. It just felt very medieval. It's just like, oh, I want to go to Brandenburg. Pass through the Brandenburg Gate and go down the road and you'll reach there.
Potsdam also has a Brandenburg Gate. This was also the case in Alexandria, of course, where the Canopic Way passed through the Canopic Gate, forming a road that eventually led to the city of Canopus.
It's like a medieval version of a giant green highway sign, or blue highway sign.
Not to be confused with Canubis. In the age of city walls, though, gate areas were public spaces in and of themselves. Taking advantage of the thousands who may have passed through on a given day, markets were not
Prime selling real estate
near a city's gate. And gate areas were also a really good place to go if you had a message you wanted lots of people to hear, as attested in the Bible. Within these walls, however, when looking at a city like Alexandria or Harappa or Chinese cities like Xi'an, you might notice something about their layout. Grid patterns. While many cities like Rome or Athens grew organically from a central point, gradually expanding generation after generation, other cities would have been built with a bit more intentionality. A Chinese text from the Spring and Autumn period, known as Kaogongji, meaning something like records on the examination of craftsmen or study of work records, actually lays out a specific plan for building a new capital city.
When designing a capital city, it should be laid out in a square grid measuring 9 by 9 li per side, with 3 gates on each of the city walls. There should be 9 streets and 9 avenues, each wide enough for 9 horse carts to pass abreast. The palace should be in the centre of the city, with the ancestral temple on the left, temples to the deities on the right, office buildings in front, and a marketplace behind.
I think of planned out grid cities as more of a modern thing, like the USA being a prime example of having a lot of cities that have grid patterns because they're more modern. They were built more recently than most European cities, and so there was a lot more planning in mind rather than just natural growth and strange roads that come out of that natural growth. It's really cool to see that it's not that modern of an idea at all. That's cool.
Right, office buildings in front, and a marketplace behind.
Many cities, however, would have started off as small villages or communities around a particular fortress, or might have grown organically around markets, natural harbors, intersections and pathways, places that looked cool, or wherever, or any other sort of place frequented by lots of people. In the case of fortresses, these often evolved into the center of their respective cities. Across the ancient Mediterranean, for instance, cities often featured a fortified center elevated on a hilltop called an acropolis, such as the famous Acropolis of Athens or the Bursa Hill of Carthage.
Just so I can get it out of my mind, and I stop thinking about it. These graphics are really good. A few times I've been like, wait, is that a real picture I'm looking at?
Cities often featured a fortified center elevated on a hilltop called an acropolis, such as the famous Acropolis of Athens or the Bursa Hill of Carthage. However, that's not all that goes into a city. What ultimately makes a city and not a village or a large walled compound is that cities are the result of enough people coming together in one space to specialize in different fields that could never be supported in a smaller settlement. Now, villages allow for some specialization, but try to open a jewelry store in a small farming village or a Ferrari dealership in Monowai, Nebraska, and your result is the same: poverty. So what was it actually like to live in one of these cities? In Rome, a popular kind of domicile among the plebs, if I'm to use that term literally, was the insula, essentially a 3-story apartment complex. Well, 4-story if you include the ground floor, which was mainly for shops. This proximity to food stores would have been especially useful before refrigerators, but the apartments themselves frequently had their own kitchens, and many
I wonder what the highest buildings in the past built without like steel and concrete today. I wonder what was the maximum amount of stories someone built with just sort of, well, I don't know the building techniques. Maybe they did have some sort of support. You know what I'm asking? Like prior to like steel rebars and modern concrete, I wonder what the tallest buildings, how many floors they had.
even had refrigerators, but the apartments themselves frequently had their own kitchens, and many even had running water as well as indoor toilets, connecting to the city's sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, which drained directly into the Tiber. Yeah, this is your quick reminder not to over-romanticize the past. You might have just been drinking feces water. Well, okay, that's not entirely true, as Roman cities were—
I wonder if the aqueducts were on a constant tilt, a very small decline so that the water kept rushing, or just the fact that there's water behind the water is going to push it forward even if it's perfectly flat. Also, that was a really cool building. That looks awesome.
Might have just been drinking feces water.
You say
okay,
cloaca?
That's not entirely true, as Roman cities were fed by their oh-so-famous aqueducts, as were particularly useful in cities like Constantinople, which even to this day, as Istanbul, needs to bring in water from elsewhere. You can learn more about that in my video on Istanbul's geography. These aqueducts brought in water from far-off springs and lakes, before being spread throughout the city in a vast network of pipes, mostly made out of lead, before emptying out into a nearby river or harbor. Rome was far from the only civilization with indoor plumbing too, as civilizations like the Indus Valley, the Hittites, and Kilwa also had their own complex urban plumbing infrastructure.
Guys, obviously it's not reason to not make aqueducts because they're so genius and useful, but aqueducts seem to be very easily sabotageable. Is that a word? Easily able to be sabotaged. If you just threw a dead animal carcass in any part of the aqueduct, you would end up likely killing, because of not great medical stuff, the hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And so I'm sure they knew that, and so would probably guard areas and would have stiff, you'd probably be put to death or something. But if you were trying to, destroy or harm the city, that seems like a pretty easy way.
Aqueducts brought in water from far-off springs and lakes before being spread throughout the city in a vast network of pipes, mostly made out of lead, before emptying out into a nearby river or harbor. Rome was far from the only civilization with indoor plumbing too, as civilizations like the Indus Valley, the Hittites, and Kilwa also had their own complex urban plumbing infrastructures. Now, zoning wasn't exactly a thing in ancient and medieval times the same way it is now, as that only became more of a thing during the Industrial Revolution, what with making it so people could not build a giant factory in the middle of a mostly residential area, but there were generally some rules and regulations in place. Butchers being probably the most notable business confined to certain areas because not everyone enjoys the smell of raw meat in the morning. Finally, if you wanted to enjoy yourself in the city, a variable number of deities know that you were not strapped for options. Want to watch a drama in a theater? It's right there. Want to see gladiators fight in an arena? Can't get that in the provinces. Or do you just want to go to a park and relax? That was sometimes an option too, although mostly later on. And be careful you weren't just walking on some prince's hunting grounds. Now, not to get all not just bikes on you, but with all the talk these days of good urban planning and how that seems to involve building cities the way we used to in the distant past, or at least before car dependency, it all begs the question, would history-loving pro-urbanists like myself want to live, not just visit, but live in a pre-industrial city? God no, I love having human rights and a steady treatment for my IBD, but we can still learn a lot from the past, and in particular, how a lot of the issues our cities face today aren't actually all that new. Different people, different technologies, similar struggle. Malaka. Now,
Yeah, I think it's easy to think of people in the past as just almost a different species, but genetically we're indistinguishable probably from people hundreds of years ago, and so they would have had the same emotions and similar struggles and stuff, just to a different degree and with different ways to fix them. So it's so crazy to think about just the more mundane parts of life back in the day where you're just like laughing with people. It's not some giant historical event, but you're just a person like we are now, looking at the world. Obviously there's not all the advanced stuff we have today, but I mean, if you go to a woods or a forest area, you're experiencing the world almost exactly like I'm sure they would have experienced it. I hope that makes sense to some people, because it's really, really cool concept.
now I should be very clear
It should be more obvious, but it wasn't to me.
in that I Malaka.
Ciao, bella.
Now I should be very clear in that I had to cut out a lot from this script in order for this video to
Malta?
actually exist. At least outside of the creative purgatory that is, this isn't perfect, this could still be a little better. So I'm not giving you anywhere close to a complete picture of all the complex, intricate ways hundreds
Creative purgatory? That's nice.
and millions of people lived in places thousands of years and kilometers apart from one another. But whether you're putting together some sort of medieval fantasy world, building a realistic Roman city in Minecraft, or you're, just curious, hopefully this video has given you at least a glimpse
Great video.
into the giants on whose shoulders we stand.
Okay, great video, great channel, Canubis. So when it comes to something I meant to say earlier when he was talking about horses in the street, oh god, the donkey dong, was, especially when he said, they wouldn't be rushing through the streets. I would imagine, especially in the inner cities, or just cities in general, walking would probably be as fast, if not faster, as being on some horse-driven cart. And so I would assume that horse transportation would mainly be for moving bulk amounts of goods, you know, rather than as a means of just transporting yourself from one place to another. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. It's a great video. Would appreciate any comments down below and answers to any questions I had. If I said something incorrect, call me out. Would love to see it. See you guys next time. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.